I never had a warm bed, human, until a human invited her into his bed.
The rain had been steady all evening, thick drops rattling against the shutters like thrown pebbles. From his desk in the loft above the chart archives, Evan Rourke worked by the yellow glow of an oil lamp, his pen moving with slow precision over a maritime survey. Outside, Cowran's Wharf lay under a haze of sea mist and smoke, the crooked alleys slick with rainwater, the air carrying the sharp tang of brine and diesel from the docks. He paused to stretch his back, rubbing the stiff muscle in his neck. 34, tall but lean, a man shaped more by years of travel than by any love for comfort. He'd once sailed with deep-water mapping crews, charting asteroid-bound cargo routes and tidal anomalies along forgotten coastlines. An accident, a crushed knee on a wet deck, had taken him off the ships for good. Now his work was stationary, correcting maps, recording shifts in currents, and keeping the archives in order for the wharf's mariners. He stood to refill his tea when movement in the street caught his attention. Through the rain-streaked window, he saw a lone figure coming down the alley from the direction of the market. Even at this distance, under the faint orange glow of a failing street lamp, something about her pace caught his eye. Not hurried, but not steady either. She stopped once in the middle of the street, glanced back over her shoulder, then kept walking. Her wrap, dark silk, not meant for weather like this, clung to her in the rain, and even through the distortion of glass and shadow, he could see bare feet against the slick cobblestones. Evan's brow tightened. Cowran's Wharf wasn't a place where you walked alone, barefoot, after dark unless you were running from something or had nowhere else to go. He watched her reach the corner opposite his building. She slowed, turned toward his side of the street, then stopped beneath the dripping eaves. For a moment, she just stood there, water running off her hair. She looked at his door, then away, as if weighing something. She took a step back, turned half away, and for a second he thought she would leave. But she didn't. She stepped forward again, her gaze locking on the heavy iron door at the base of his stairs. Evan moved away from the window. The knock came a few seconds later, slow, hesitant, uneven. He could almost picture her hand pausing between each tap. He crossed the loft, the floorboards creaking under his boots, unlatched the door, and swung it open. Rain spilled in through the gap, along with the sight of her up close. She was taller than he'd guessed, her skin a deep, even blue, her long violet hair plastered to her shoulders and chest, strands curling slightly from the damp. The ceremonial wrap she wore was torn at the seam along her thigh, showing smooth skin and the edge of a small scar. Her bare feet were scraped and raw from the stones. She looked at him directly, silver eyes unblinking in the lamplight. Her voice was low, measured, and carried no false sweetness. "I've never had a warm bed, human. Not once." Evan's first instinct was to ask where she'd come from, who had left her like this, but there was no sign of anyone else in the alley. The only sound was the rain. He saw the way her left hand clutched the edge of her wrap, and the way her right held on to the doorframe, like she was bracing against the possibility of rejection. He stepped back without a word. She entered, keeping to the edge of the room at first. The heat from the small stove reached her, steam already starting to lift from her hair and shoulders. "Evan Rourke," he said, offering his name as he shut the door. Her chin lifted slightly. "Cereal." He gestured to the wool blanket folded on the bench. "You're soaked through. There's tea if you want it." She took the blanket but didn't wrap it around herself, her gaze drifting toward the bed under the sloped ceiling, wide, low, covered in thick gray wool. Her attention lingered there for just a second before she looked back at him. "I've been walking since morning," she said, "looking for somewhere I wouldn't be turned away from the threshold." Her eyes flicked to the map table. "You keep your charts in order. I thought you might keep other things in order too." Evan's focus shifted to the satchel she carried under her wrap. She loosened its tie and opened it just enough for him to see resin-sealed index cards, each covered in precise, tied notes and reef diagrams. Dock traders would trade for those: food, shelter, repairs. "I trade these," she said plainly. "Tonight, I trade them for a bed." "You can have the bed," Evan replied after a moment. "You can have it to yourself or share it. That's your choice." Her shoulders eased slightly. If I'm in it, I don't want to be alone. There was no teasing in her tone. Just fact. Evan poured tea into 2 cracked mugs and set one in front of her. She drank slowly, her eyes on him the whole time. When the cup was empty, she placed it down, slid the satchel onto the table, and walked to the bed. The torn hem of her wrap shifted with each step, the fabric clinging to her hips. She sat on the edge and looked back at him. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," he said. She moved under the coverlet, adjusting the wrap strap off one shoulder. The lamplight caught the damp line of her collarbone. Evan unbuttoned his shirt, hung it over the chair, and joined her, keeping space between them at first. The heat from the stove lingered in the bed. She moved closer, her knee brushing his thigh. "I don't want to be bought," she said. "I just want to be warm." "Then that's all it is," he answered. She rested her hand lightly on his ribs. He placed his hand on her hip, over the silk, waiting. When she leaned into it, the space between them closed. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, for the first time that night, she wasn't moving anymore. As a tension in her muscles, the kind that had nothing to do with the cold and everything to do with being in a stranger's bed. He could see her eyes in the low light, silver catching every flicker of the lamp. They weren't closed. "You walked the docks all day," he said quietly, his voice low enough to blend with the rain outside. "From where?" She shifted slightly, drawing her knees closer under the coverlet. "Outer Pier, Trader's Quarter, and then inland, past the old grain warehouses. I didn't stay anywhere for more than an hour. I had reasons." He didn't press. The way she said it told him she was testing how much he would pry. Still, a detail caught his attention. Those warehouses are nearly empty now. No reason to pass through unless you're avoiding the main road. Her lips curved, but not in amusement. "Exactly. I avoid being seen by certain kinds of people. Men who think blue skin means ownership. Women who see me and think they should lower their voice because I'm mixed." She hesitated before the word, as if it wasn't her favorite. Evan let that sit. "You've been here before, then?" "Not to this part of the wharf." Her gaze drifted toward the table where her satchel rested. "I've been in Cowan's Port 3 times. Never stayed longer than a week. Never had a reason to." She looked back at him, her expression steady. Tonight was different. He could hear what she wasn't saying. She hadn't come to his door by accident. Something, or someone, had narrowed her choices. But he wasn't going to make her relive it on the first night. "You'll stay dry here," he said. "You can work at that table in the mornings if you want. The charts are old enough to need more than one set of eyes." Her brow lifted slightly. "That's an offer?" "Yes. Payment in food and a bed." Cyril studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You didn't ask what I was doing before I got here. I figured you'd tell me when you wanted to." That answer seemed to earn him a sliver of trust. She shifted again, closing more of the space between them, her knee pressing lightly into his side under the blanket. "I'll tell you one thing now. I used to crew on a coastal skimmer for a Zyrene trader. It wasn't much work, but it paid in shelter and meals. 3 weeks ago, the crew split. They said I wasn't worth the berth because of my heritage. The trader didn't argue. I've been moving since." That explained the worn satchel, the careful tied notes, the fact she still carried them in order even while soaking wet. Evan felt a tightness in his chest, not from pity but from recognition. "You know currents," he said. Her eyes softened slightly. "Better than most dockmasters. And I don't lie about them." He found himself liking that answer more than he expected. "Then you're useful here." The corner of her mouth twitched. Useful is better than owned. The rain eased for a few moments, the silence between drops making the room feel more enclosed. Evan could smell the faint salt on her skin now, a mix of rainwater and the air outside. He thought about how quickly he'd made the decision to let her in and realized it wasn't only because she looked cold. It was because she looked like she wouldn't ask twice. "Are you staying tonight only?" he asked. "That depends," she said, her tone careful. "On whether you mean what you say about choice." "I do." That seemed to settle something in her. She lay back fully, her head on the second pillow, turning toward him. The blanket shifted, and the torn edge of her wrap moved slightly over her hip. Her hand rested on his chest now, light but deliberate. "You want the truth?" she asked. "Yes." I came here because you were the only one I saw who didn't watch me like a thief or a debt. You saw me in the street before I knocked, didn't you? Evan nodded once. I did. You stopped under the eaves and almost left. I thought you might need someone to keep the door open. For the first time since she entered, she smiled without restraint, small but real. That's the right answer. They lay in quiet after that, the storm returning in heavier waves against the window. The lamplight flickered, casting their shadows long against the far wall. Evan realized he hadn't thought about the tide charts or the corrections waiting on his desk in over an hour. Serial's breathing steadied, her eyes closing finally. Tomorrow, she murmured, almost too quiet to hear, I'll show you the reef line you missed. Evan let the quiet swallow the words, knowing they weren't about the reef at all. Evan woke to the sound of the stove's metal sides, ticking as the heat faded. The rain hadn't stopped. It pressed against the shutters in bursts, sometimes sharp, sometimes like a steady hand sliding across the wood. The first thing he noticed was that Serial was still in the bed, not lying at the far edge, not sitting up ready to leave. She was on her side, facing him, hair loose over her cheek, the blanket pulled high enough to cover her shoulder. Her breathing was steady, but not the rhythm of deep sleep. She was awake, waiting. You're not gone, he said quietly. Her eyes opened. You said I could stay. I meant it. He sat up, leaning against the wall, watching her take in the room from this closer view. The shelves lined with charts, the small crate of tools by the table, the damp boots by the door. She hesitated before asking, Do you live alone? Yes. Always. He thought about the years since leaving the crew. For a while now. I've had company on some nights, but no one stayed past morning. She didn't react much, just nodded, as if that answer fit what she expected. Then why didn't you ask me to leave? Evan shrugged slightly. Because you didn't look like someone who needed more doors closing on you. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in distrust, but in calculation. Most men in this district would have asked for more than a bed in return. I didn't, he said, and left it there. She shifted, the blanket sliding down enough to show the strap of her wrap back on her shoulder now. I know. That's why I'm still here. Evan could tell she was still measuring him. Trust didn't happen in a single night, even if they'd shared warmth under the same blanket. She glanced toward the table where her satchel, still Saturday. You haven't looked through it. It's yours, he said. You offer me information, not the bag. Her lips pressed together for a moment, as if she'd been waiting to see if he'd say something like that. She pushed herself upright, legs still under the blanket, and studied his face. Do you want to know who I was avoiding yesterday? Yes, he said simply. A man named Varesh. Zairini. He ran the skimmer I worked on before. When he left port last month, I thought I'd seen the last of him. But 2 days ago, I saw him again at the market here. I didn't want him to see me. Why? She paused, choosing her words. Because he's the kind who doesn't like letting go of what he's called his. If he saw me, he'd expect me to work for him again. And if I refused, he'd make sure no other ship took me on. That explained the deliberate route she'd taken through the city, the side streets, the empty warehouses. She hadn't been wandering. She'd been staying invisible. Eva nodded once. Then you're safer here. Her head tilted slightly. For how long? As long as you want, he said. That seemed to settle something. She pushed the blanket back and swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her bare feet touched the wood, and she hissed softly, not in pain exactly, but from the contact with the cool floor. Evan stood, crossed the corner, and pulled out a pair of thick wool socks from a crate. He handed them to her without comment. She looked at them for a moment before taking them. These are not something people usually give me. What do they usually give you? He asked. A deal, a trade, or a reason to move on. She pulled the socks on, the fabric loose but warm. Evan busied himself at the stove, stoking the small flame back to life. What's your plan for today? She considered the question. If your offer stands, I'll stay here. Sort my notes. Help with the charts. I can cook if you have food. That's a plan, he said. We'll need to make it to the market later. Supplies won't last long. Her expression tightened a little, and he caught it. What? The market is where Varesh might be, she admitted. Then we'll pick a time he's least likely to be there, Evan said. You don't have to see him. Her shoulders eased slightly. You do that. Yes. The moment hung there between them, unembellished, but it shifted the air in the room. She had walked in last night as someone with nowhere to stop. Now she was talking about helping him work, about cooking in his space, about staying through the day. It was a change neither of them said aloud, but it was there. She stood, adjusting the wrap around her. The torn seam still showed her thigh when she moved, and she didn't bother to hide it now. Then I'll make breakfast. Evan watched her cross to the small counter where he kept what little food he had, dried grain, a jar of preserved fish, 2 small tins of tea. She handled the items with a kind of precision, setting things out neatly. He realized something then. She wasn't just staying because of the warmth or the shelter. She was staying because he'd given her the first set of conditions she could control. Outside, the rain began to slow, but neither of them looked toward the door. They had things to do inside first. The morning light in Cowran's wharf wasn't bright so much as diluted, pale gold struggling through the cloud cover, reflecting off the wet cobblestones in a dull sheen. Evan stood at the loft's window with his hands braced on the sill, scanning the street below. The rain had slowed to a fine mist, and the port was waking in its usual way. Cart wheels creaking over uneven stones, the distant rumble of cranes at the docks, voices carrying in quick bursts as traders opened their stalls. It was the right time to go to the market, early enough to avoid the heavy crowd, late enough that most of the overnight crews had gone back to their ships. Behind him, Cereal was at the small counter, her satchel open and its contents spread in neat order. Resin-sealed cards covered the wood in 2 lines, each one marked with tiny symbols and hand-drawn compass points. She moved with care, sorting the cards into groups, occasionally tapping one against the counter before setting it aside. "You're mapping more than just currents," Evan said without turning from the window. "I keep wind patterns too, and shoal movement. They're harder to track, but worth it if you know where to look." She didn't pause in her work. "I also keep a separate set of notes for things I'd rather not trade. Hidden docks, channels that don't exist on official maps." Evan glanced back. "You trust me enough to tell me that." She met his eyes briefly. "I trust you enough to know you won't sell it." That answered another question he hadn't voiced in the last 2 days. How much of what she carried was meant for trade, and how much was survival knowledge she would never give away? By the time they'd eaten, grain boiled with preserved fish and a small handful of dried herbs she'd found in his supplies, the street noise had changed. The heavy clatter of morning loading was gone. It was market time. Evan grabbed a worn canvas bag from the peg near the door. "We keep it short, just what we need." Cereal wrapped the blanket once around her shoulders before discarding it in favor of pulling her silk wrap tighter. She adjusted the loose strap so it sat more securely and tied the satchel across her chest. She still had no shoes. "You can't walk the market barefoot," Evan said. "I've walked worse," she replied. "I know. Doesn't mean you should." He reached under the work table, pulling out a pair of soft leather shoes he'd repaired weeks ago. They were slightly too big for her, but better than nothing. She slipped them on without argument, glancing up once as if to acknowledge the gesture without making it into a scene. They stepped out into the street. The air carried the smell of wet stone and fresh catch from the docks. People moved in clusters, hoods drawn, shoulders hunched against the lingering mist. Cereal stayed just half a step behind Evan, her gaze scanning the crowd, her shoulders held in that cautious, ready posture he'd seen the night before she knocked on his door. At the market's edge, rows of makeshift stalls lined the narrow lane, their tarps dripping from the earlier rain. Vendors called out prices, their voices competing with the sound of scales clinking and crates shifting. Evan kept his pace even, stopping only at the stalls they needed: dried grain, salted meat, a small sack of root vegetables. It was while he was paying for the grain that Cereal's hand brushed his arm, a light touch but deliberate. He turned his head just enough to see her eyes shift toward the far side of the market. "Varesh?" he asked under his breath. "No, but someone from his crew." Her voice stayed low, steady. "2 stalls over. He hasn't seen me yet." Evan didn't look immediately. He took the grain, thanked the vendor, then moved on as if nothing was wrong. When they reached a quieter gap between stalls, he spoke without slowing. "You want to leave?" "Yes," she said quickly. "We have what we need." They cut through a side lane, avoiding the main road back. Only when they were 3 streets away did she ease her pace. He was the one who used to run the deck when Varesh wasn't there. Not someone I want to talk to. Evan didn't push for more. They walked the rest of the way to the loft without speaking. Inside, Serial set the satchel down and pulled off the shoes, leaving them neatly by the door. I don't like that I still have to think about who's in the same street, she said. You'll think about it less when you have something worth staying in one place for, Evan replied. Her eyes stayed on him for a long moment. And you think this is that place? I think it could be. There was a shift in her posture then, not relaxed, but not defensive either. She crossed to the table and began sorting the new supplies. If I stay, I work. I don't take without giving back. You already have, Evan said. Those notes of yours will save me weeks of corrections. She gave the smallest hint of a smile. Then I'll start with the charts after we eat tonight. By mid-afternoon, the rain had picked up again, a steady drumming on the roof. Evan worked at the table, redrawing a section of coastline. Serial sat across from him, her hair drying in loose waves, her focus locked on the resin cards she was translating into his maps. Now, and then their hands brushed when passing tools. A compass, a ruler, a sharp stick of graphite. Neither pulled back quickly. It was in one of those brief touches that Evan realized something. The wariness in her eyes when they'd first met was shifting. It wasn't gone, but it was being replaced with something slower, something that looked a lot like consideration. She caught him watching her once and didn't look away immediately. That night, when they lay down, she didn't wait for him to close the space between them. She moved first, settling against his side under the blanket, her hand resting lightly on his chest. And for the first time since she'd arrived, she closed her eyes without hesitation. The room was dim except for the steady amber glow from the lamp on the low crate beside the bed. The sound of rain on the roof was softer now, a background hum instead of the earlier drumbeat. Evan lay on his back, eyes half open, feeling the slow rise and fall of Serial's breathing against his ribs. She hadn't drifted off yet. He could tell by the small adjustments she made, the way her fingertips moved slightly on his chest, the faint shift of her thigh along his. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but certain. You said I could set the pace. I meant it, he replied. She lifted her head just enough to look at him. Then I'm telling you, I'm ready to stop leaving space between us. There was no hesitation in her tone, but there was weight. It was a choice, not a reflex. Evan's hand rested against her side, feeling the silk of her wrap, the warmth beneath it. Then we do this your way, he said. Her eyes didn't leave his as she slid the blanket down from her shoulder. The strap of her wrap slipped free, revealing the smooth line of her collarbone and the slope of her shoulder. She didn't rush, didn't look away, watching to see if he'd hold her gaze. He did. She moved closer, one leg slipping over his. The faint dampness left in her hair brushed his jaw as she leaned in. Their lips met, slow at first, the kind of kiss that tested pressure and heat. Then she deepened it, her hand moving to the back of his neck. He answered with the same unhurried rhythm, letting her set how far and how fast. Her wrap loosened more as she shifted, and he placed his hand at her hip, fingers brushing the edge of the torn seam. She pressed into his palm instead of pulling back. The air between them was warmer now, the smell of rain fading into the faint salt of her skin. You're still sure? He asked against her mouth. Yes. That one word closed the gap between where they had been and where they were going. He pulled her closer, feeling the heat of her body align with his. Her hands moved under the open collar of his shirt, tracing the shape of his chest, learning it as if she intended to remember every detail. When she finally shrugged the wrap down from her shoulders entirely, it pooled at her waist. She watched him as his hands moved along her back, fingertips mapping the length of her spine. There was no flinch, no guarded recoil, only a steady acceptance that was more intimate than the touch itself. They moved together gradually, the blanket slipping lower, the space between them gone entirely now. Every shift of weight, every exhale was deliberate, unforced. It wasn't hurried passion, but a steady deepening, each of them reading the other in real time. Her breathing quickened, his followed, and when their pace finally broke from slow to certain, It was because both had reached the same place at the same moment. After, she stayed pressed against him, her head resting just under his chin. No retreat, no reaching for the wrap to cover herself again. Just stillness and the faint sound of the rain returning outside. Evan felt her hand rest over his heart, her thumb brushing lightly against his skin. "I didn't think it could feel like this without feeling trapped," she said quietly. "You're not trapped," he answered. "I know," she said, and he could hear in her voice that she meant it. She stayed close as sleep began to take her. The weight of her body relaxed in a way it hadn't been the first night. Evan lay awake a little longer, watching the slow flicker of the lamp, knowing the change tonight wasn't just physical. It was a decision, one that could not be taken back, and one he didn't want to. Evan woke to the pale light of morning bleeding through the shutters. The rain had stopped some time before dawn, leaving the air heavy with the smell of wet stone and the faint tang of salt drifting in from the harbor. The stove had gone cold in the night, but the bed was still warm, Serial's body pressed along his side, one arm draped across his chest. She was awake. He knew because her breathing wasn't the slow, even rhythm of sleep. It was a little quicker, as if she'd been lying there thinking for some time. When he looked down, her eyes were open, silver irises catching the muted light. "Morning," he said quietly. She didn't answer right away. Her hand flexed slightly against his chest before she withdrew it and sat up, pulling the blanket with her. She didn't cover herself fully, just enough to break the closeness they'd shared all night. "I don't usually stay after," she said, her voice flat, almost matter-of-fact. Evan pushed himself up against the wall, watching her pull her hair over one shoulder. "You stayed last night. That's why I'm thinking about leaving now." She kept her eyes on the floorboards, her jaw tight. He didn't move toward her yet. "Because you don't want to feel like you owe me something?" Her eyes flicked to his, sharp for a moment. "Because every time I've let this happen before, it turned into a reason for someone to claim me, to make decisions for me. I don't." She stopped herself, shaking her head. "I needed last night to be what it was. But I can't wake up and feel like I've traded my freedom for warmth." Evan let the words sit in the air before he spoke. "Then you don't owe me anything. Not for last night. Not for staying here. Not for food. Not for work on the charts. You can leave if you want. You can stay if you want. That doesn't change." Serial studied him, searching for any sign that he was saying what he thought she wanted to hear. "I need you to understand," she said slowly. "I've had people be kind to me before, and it always turned. Always. They decided my choices for me. And I don't trust easily after that." Evan nodded once. "I'm not them." For a moment, the loft was silent except for the faint sound of a gull outside. Then she exhaled, a little unsteady, and the tension in her shoulders eased. "I believe you," she said, though it sounded like she was still testing the weight of the words. She set the blanket aside and stood, moving toward her satchel on the table. She took out a card and placed it in front of him, a hand-drawn inlet with a narrow channel leading to a hidden cove. "No one else has this," she said. "I've never traded it, never shown it, not even to Varesh." Evan leaned forward, taking in the details. "Why show me? Because if you wanted to trap me, you'd already have tried." It wasn't an apology, but it was a kind of offering. He set the card back on the table carefully. "We'll mark it later. Together." Her mouth twitched in the faintest shadow of a smile. "Then maybe I'll make breakfast again." The shift between them wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was there. The space she'd put between them when she first woke was gone by the time they sat down to eat, their shoulders brushing now and then as they moved around the cramped counter. When they finished, she stood by the window, looking out at the brightening street. "The market will be busier today. We'll have to be careful if we go." "We don't have to rush," Evan said. "We got enough for a day or two." She nodded, but he caught the way her eyes scanned the street like a sailor reading weather signs. Old habits not ready to die. He didn't tell her she could relax. He just stepped up beside her, close enough that their arms touched, and let her see the street from his point of view. Nothing pressing, nothing chasing them, just another day starting. By midday, the clouds had broken in scattered pieces, sunlight dropping into the street in narrow, shifting stripes. The air smelled of drying stone and warm tar from the docks. Evan had moved the map table closer to the window for better light, and Serial was bent over a section of coastline, her hair falling forward as she inked a correction onto the vellum. He watched her work from across the table, not speaking. She was precise, deliberate, not just marking the reef line she'd shown him earlier, but adjusting the surrounding currents to reflect how they shifted seasonally. It was the kind of attention only someone who had been out there in the water could give. "You've done this before," he said finally. She didn't look up. "Years. Mostly for other people's maps. And they took the credit. They took the maps. Credit didn't matter to them." Her tone was even, but he heard the undercurrent. He leaned back in his chair. "It matters here." That made her pause. She glanced up, silver eyes narrowing slightly. "What do you mean? When these charts are copied, your marks stay on them. Your name stays on them. Anyone who sees them will know who mapped them." Serial studied him for a moment, as if trying to see the angle. The catch that would turn this offer into another transaction she'd regret later. When she didn't find one, she set the pen down and sat back. "Why would you do that?" "Because I'm tired of working alone," Evan said. "Because I could use someone who knows more than I do about half these waters. And because you've been walking from port to port with information worth more than the people you've given it to." Her fingers tapped lightly against the table's edge. "So you're asking me to stay?" "I'm saying you could," he replied. "Not because you owe me, not because of last night, because it would make both our lives easier, and maybe better." She leaned back in her chair, eyes still on him, measuring the space between the offer and the cost. "If I said yes, what would that mean?" "It means we start splitting work, income, supplies. It means you don't have to keep looking for the next door that might let you in. And it means if someone like Varesh comes looking, you're not standing in that street alone." He let the words hang there. Serial's gaze drifted to the satchel sitting on the shelf, the resin cards stacked neatly inside. "If I said yes," she said slowly, "you'd have to understand there will be days I want to walk away. Not because of you, but because that's what I've learned to do when things get close." Evan nodded. "Then you walk out the door, and if you want to come back, you do. No locks, no debts." Her jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in the way someone braces against believing something that feels too solid to be real. She rose from the chair and walked to the window, leaning one shoulder against the frame. "If I stayed, I need more than a place to sleep. I need something to make it feel like mine." Evan joined her at the window. "Then we find something, we build it." The noise from the street below rose as the late-day traders began calling out their last offers. A cart rattled past, the driver snapping his reins. Serial didn't look down. She stayed focused on the sky breaking open above the rooftops. "When I was younger," she said, "I stayed with a family in a small harbor town for almost a year. I worked their skiff, helped with their nets. I thought it was home. Then one day, they decided they needed the berth for someone else. No warning. Just done. That's why I don't make routes. They get pulled." Evan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Then we make something they can't pull. We choose it, and we keep it." Her eyes shifted to him, holding his for several seconds. Then she exhaled slowly, like someone stepping onto unfamiliar ground. "If I stay, it's not just for shelter. It's because I'm choosing it. Choosing you." The words landed heavier than either of them expected. "You're sure?" he asked. "Yes," she said, "but I need something in return." "What?" "Don't ever make me feel like a guest in this room again." Evan gave a short nod. "Deal." She stepped back from the window and crossed the loft, loosening the tie on her satchel. She placed the stack of resin cards on the map table without separating them into trade and private sets. "If I'm staying, you have all of it. We keep it together." It was the clearest answer she could give. That evening, they worked side by side until the lamplight grew too dim to see fine lines. When they finally stopped, Serial moved toward the bed without hesitation, pulling the blanket back. She didn't wait for him to follow, but when he did, she shifted to make room, settling in against him with the kind of closeness that no longer needed to be tested. As the rain returned in a soft patter against the roof, Evan realized the question of whether she would leave had finally been replaced with something new, the question of how they would build what came next. And for the first time, both of them seemed ready to find out. 3 days had passed since Serial placed all her resin cards on the table and told him she was staying. The loft had begun to look different, Not because Evan had changed it, but because she had. Her blanket no longer stayed folded on the bench. It was on the bed every morning. The satchel was no longer tucked away on the shelf. It sat open on the work table, maps and cards spilling out in small, neat stacks. There was a spare mug by the stove now, a bundle of dried herbs tied to the rafter to keep them off the counter. On the fourth morning, Evan found her standing by the window, watching the harbor through the break in the clouds. The smell of fresh bread drifted up from the bakery down the street. "I've been thinking," she said, without turning from the view. "If I'm working here with you, we should have more than one table, and more than one chair that isn't half broken." He stepped up beside her. "Then we'll go to the docks today. Not the market. The carpenters." She glanced at him, a quick sideways look. "You're serious?" "Yes. If you're staying, we make the space work for both of us." The carpenter's shed was 2 streets over, near the ship repair yard. By midday, they were hauling a small but solid work table up the narrow loft stairs, laughing once when the legs caught on the railing. They set it near the stove for her, a place to work on her notes without taking over the map table. She ran her palm over the surface once it was in place, as if testing its grain. "It's mine," she said quietly. "It's ours," Evan corrected, and she didn't argue. That afternoon, they reorganized the shelves. Evan moved his older charts to the far end, leaving space for the new maps they'd finished together. Serial placed her resin cards in a box they both could reach, no locked compartments. By evening, the work was done. The loft smelled faintly of cut wood from the new table. The rain had returned, light but steady, tapping on the shutters. Serial sat cross-legged on the bed, hair loose and still slightly damp from when she'd gone downstairs to fill the water barrel. Evan watched her from the chair, taking in the difference in her posture from the night she first arrived. No cautious hunch in her shoulders, no scanning the corners of the room before speaking. "You've stopped looking at the door every few minutes," he said. She tilted her head. "Maybe because I know I don't have to leave through it." They ate late, simple food, grain and roasted vegetables, sitting on the bed with the plates between them. When they were done, she set the plates aside and leaned back against the wall, stretching her legs out until her toes brushed his thigh. "You know," she said, "there's one thing I haven't done yet." "What's that?" "Taking my name off the list of transient dock workers." She smirked faintly. "Means no more sleeping in holding quarters, no more waiting for a berth that won't come. Means this address becomes mine." Evan felt the weight of that more than he expected. "You want me there when you do it?" "I want you to come with me tomorrow," she said, serious now. "Not because I need you to speak for me, but because it would feel right if you were there." He nodded once. "Then I'll be there." They sat in quiet for a while, the rain filling the space where words weren't needed. Eventually, she shifted closer, swinging her legs over his lap, her knees bracketing him on the chair. Her hands rested lightly on his shoulders, her gaze steady. "When I first came here," she said, "I thought it would be one night. Maybe 2 if the bed was as warm as you said. I didn't think I'd want more." She leaned forward, her forehead brushing his. "Now, I don't want to think about leaving." He slid his arms around her, pulling her close until there was no space left between them. The kiss that followed wasn't cautious like their first, or testing like the night they crossed the line. It was certain, the kind of contact that didn't need to ask permission anymore, because it had been freely given 100 times since. Later, they lay in bed, the blanket pulled high, her head tucked under his chin. Outside, the street below was quiet except for the occasional cart rolling by. Inside, the only movement was the slow rhythm of their breathing. "This is ours now," she said softly. "It always was," he replied. She smiled against his chest, and when her breathing finally slowed into sleep, Evan stayed awake just long enough to take in the room. The new table, the shared maps, the open satchel. Evidence that she had chosen to be here. Evidence that this wasn't just shelter anymore. And as the rain kept falling steady outside, he closed his eyes knowing there would be no more mornings wondering if she'd be gone. The morning sun came in through the open shutters, spilling across the work tables in wide, warm stripes. The smell of fresh bread from the bakery downstairs drifted in with the breeze, mixing with the sharper tang of salt air from the harbor. Evan sat at the main map table, a folded sheet of parchment in front of him, while Serial worked at the smaller table near the stove, sorting through a stack of resin cards. It had been a week since she'd removed her name from the transient dock list. The change had been almost invisible at first. No announcement, no ceremony, but it had settled into the loft like the scent of dried herbs she now kept above the stove. There was a different quality to the air between them now, a steadiness that came from not wondering if one of them would be gone in the morning. She looked up from her work. There's a fishing vessel in tomorrow. Small crew. They'll need updated charts for the northern shoals. Evan nodded. We'll have them ready. The exchange was simple, but it carried the ease of two people who had fallen into the rhythm of working and living side by side. No measuring every word for hidden meaning, no guarded pauses. By midday, the loft was warmer than usual, the sun shifting high enough to heat the roof. Serial stood by the open window, her hair catching the light in strands of violet and silver. She wore her usual wrap, but today it was tied loosely at her waist, the folds open enough to catch the occasional lift of the breeze. You know, she said, glancing back at him, we've worked every day since I decided to stay. He looked up from the chart. You want to take the afternoon off? I want to take us off the afternoon, she corrected, the corner of her mouth curving. He set the pen down, watching her turn from the window, the sunlight painting her skin in warm tones. She crossed the loft with unhurried steps, stopping in front of his chair. What's the occasion? He asked. Her silver eyes held his. That we can. No other reason. She held out her hand. He took it, letting her pull him up. The chair scraped lightly against the floor as he stood. She led him toward the bed, the blanket already folded back, the sheets faintly scented from the herbs she'd washed them with 2 days ago. This time there was no cautious pause, no space to bridge. They came together in a kiss that was slow but immediately certain, her hands on the back of his neck, his arms sliding around her waist. The wrap loosened under his fingers, slipping down her shoulders to the floor. She let it fall without breaking the kiss, pressing closer until the heat between them was unmistakable. He laid her back on the bed, the sunlight catching the line of her hip as she shifted to make room for him. His hand traced her side, learning the smooth contours in an unhurried sweep, the pace set not by urgency, but by the quiet luxury of knowing there was no clock running down. She met every touch with her own, fingers exploring the planes of his chest, the line of his ribs, the small scars he'd never pointed out but didn't hide. Their breathing grew heavier as clothing gave way to skin, the air warming between them. He took the time to kiss her slowly, her jaw, the hollow of her throat, the curve of her shoulder, before returning to her mouth. She arched into him when his hand moved over her hip, guiding him with subtle shifts of her body. When they moved together, it wasn't hurried or fumbling. It was the steady rhythm of people who had already crossed the threshold of trust and now wanted to stay there as long as possible. The sounds in the room, the catch of her breath, the low hum in his throat, the faint rustle of the blanket, blended with the faint gull cries outside. He watched her eyes as they moved, saw them half closed not from uncertainty, but from complete focus on the moment. Her fingers dug lightly into his shoulders, then slid down his back, pulling him closer until there was no space left at all. They stayed connected long after the pace eased, her body warm and relaxed under his. He shifted only enough to lie beside her, pulling the blanket over them. She turned into him, pressing her face into his neck, her hair falling across his chest. This, she said quietly, is the part one never had before. Staying after. You're staying now, he said. Her lips brushed his skin in a faint smile. Yes, and tomorrow, and the day after. Outside, the sunlight began to fade, but neither of them moved. There was no reason to. They had already chosen this, and each other, and now there was nothing left to wait for.